Hello, my name is Simon Godwin, and I am the Artistic Director of the Shakespeare Theatre Company in Washington, D.C. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the Shakespeare Hour. Well, everyone, the secret is out. As I have mentioned in previous episodes, I have been on a secret Shakespeare mission, which has led me to London, the National Theatre of London, to be precise, where I'm sitting right now. And I'm here because in the summer, I was meant to have been here directing Romeo and Juliet, the stage production. This was sadly cancelled due to COVID-19, but the National Theatre, in collaboration with Sky Arts and PBS, have come together and made it possible for us to create a film of Romeo and Juliet. So next week, I start rehearsals for 4 weeks, and then followed by 3 weeks of shooting for Romeo and Juliet, the movie. Now, the good news is that because of our partners, PBS, you all will be able to see the film of Romeo and Juliet, which, if all goes well, will be broadcast across America in March. So tonight we're going to be talking about Shakespeare, of course, Shakespeare and the National Theatre, and also Romeo and Juliet. So lots to discuss, and I'm going to be giving you updates every episode between now and Christmas about how it's all going on Romeo and Juliet, the film. Well, let us now get started, and I would love to introduce to you my guests. Emily Vance, Resident Director of the National Theatre and the Associate Director and Editor of TIMON of Athens, which STC audiences will remember from earlier this year. And Emily is also adapting Romeo and Juliet for the screen. So Emily, hello and welcome to the show.
Hello, Simon. Thank you for having me.
Emily, how are you feeling about this idea of taking a play, Romeo and Juliet? We're still going to be filming it in the theatre, but without an audience, and turning it into a film. Obviously, we'll talk about it in detail in a moment, but how are you generally feeling about that on the horizon?
It's extremely exciting to be back in the theatre. It's been wonderful to come back into that crucible of a lot of people who are used to working together in a very short period of time to make something. There is the daunting feeling that the thing that will be created on this occasion will be less ephemeral than what is usually made, and a record of it will exist beyond that is usually held in people's minds. So that there's a certain frisson about that. And I think particularly the experience of the film world and the theatre world having to meet in this new space and create something together has been eye-opening. But overall, huge excitement.
Great, Emily. Well, I think you speak for so many theatres around the world that are now trying to figure out their future and how to bring different art forms together to create these sort of hybrid versions of the classic stories that we all love. So hold on tight. Dr. Daniel Rosenthal, who many have called the definitive National Theatre historian, joins us as well. His books include The National Theatre Story and Dramatic Exchanges, The Lives and Letters of the National Theatre. Daniel, hello, welcome.
Thanks very much, Simon. Lovely to be here.
Oh, good. Now, Daniel, have you had a chance during this period of closure to be catching up on lots of writing about plays, even if you haven't managed to see many of them?
I've done a certain amount, but not to the same extent as yourself and Emily. But there was a project I was developing with the National, which has had to go into I hope not deep freeze, but let's say it's gone into limbo for now. And touch wood, we'll be able to revisit that. And I had a strange, very, I think, poignant experience about halfway through the lockdown, where the National Theatre Development Department organised this fascinating Zoom platform between myself and the 4 directors who had been due to direct the next 4 shows to open at the National chronologically after the lockdown. So it was Fiona Buffini, Dominic Cook, Ian Rickson, and Thea Sharrock. And it was, if nothing else, it was a very particular record of their states of mind about missing out on the work. And also, it was quite soon before the British government announced this package of approximately $2 billion of taxpayer support for the theatre. So chairing that was really, none of us knew at that point when the NT might reopen, as happily, the Olivier is now back open for socially distanced performances. So of all of the platforms I've chaired over the years, that was the strangest by a long way.
Mm. My goodness, I can absolutely imagine, but it's a reminder for those of us working in America here with something that the welfare state has really helped with. It's a proper amount of money that the British government has given to the arts for this great bailout, and yes, I feel jealous of that. But it's fantastic news, of course. Sargon Yelder, acclaimed British actor who's been seen on stage at the Old Vic, the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Royal Court, and of course the National, where he played Pompey in the 2018 production of Antony and Cleopatra, which I had the privilege of directing. Sargon, hello, how are you?
Very well indeed, Simon. Lovely to see you again.
Very nice to see you. Now, we were talking, Daniel was mentioning about plays that were stopped before they even happened. You, I believe, were in the middle of rehearsing a certain play when the lockdown happened. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I was in the middle of rehearsing Romeo and Juliet at the Globe Theatre before we were very cruelly shut down. Although I probably can't expound too much on the process itself, because there is a hope that it will be revived. So hopefully it's that there's some unfinished business with that, and hopefully we'll get back to it before long.
Good. Well, that's great, Sargon. I won't press you then on the super secret complex concept that maybe you were exploring, because we hope that we'll get to see it in person at the Globe, hopefully very soon. Terrific. Well, welcome, and thank you for joining us. And finally, my colleague and co-host, Dr. Drew Lichtenberg, STC's resident dramaturg and literary manager, is here with us, of course, as well. Drew, how are you in Washington?
Hello, Simon. It's good to be joining you, as always, from my basement in Petworth in Washington, D.C., and to be joining, indeed, Emily and Sargon and Daniel for this very exciting conversation. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone watching at home, as Simon said, we are discussing Shakespeare in the National Theatre tonight. And because this conversation is pre-recorded, we have solicited questions from you, our viewers, whom we love, which I will be peppering through our conversation. Well, let's get down to it. Last week, we discussed Shakespeare in Britain Today with Gregory Duran and Ferran from, respectively, the RSC and the Globe. And we're sort of completing the trifecta tonight, talking about Shakespeare and the National Theatre. So the question that we have given to our panelists, which we would like to start with, although we will probably get to Romeo and Juliet, this very exciting, newly announced project that Simon and Emily are working on in the second half of the show. But we'd like to start by taking a more global approach and asking the question of, what does Shakespeare mean in Britain today? And you can interpret that however you want, mid-COVID, with all the work that has been lost, as I'm reminded hearing you all talk of rehearsals suddenly canceled, or platforms of directors pondering the loss of production at the National, which is a huge deal in any theater professional's career. Is it post-Brexit? Is it more localized now, since national borders seem to be reasserting themselves with a vengeance in the 21st century? And there's also the question of Shakespeare specifically at the National Theatre, which Daniel's research brilliantly illustrates has been a core part of the identity of the National Theatre since its inception. And Daniel, I think we'd actually like to start with you for a little bit of historical perspective on this question, because I think when you hear the words the National Theatre, you don't immediately think of Shakespeare, but as you write, that is maybe something that is not true, that we should think of Shakespeare as a core part of the identity.
Absolutely. I mean, there would not be a National Theatre of Great Britain if Shakespeare weren't this great national figure. And you have to track very, very briefly a 115-year gap between the first notion of a national theatre, which is in 1848, and the publisher William Effingham Wilson publishing a pamphlet, A House for Shakespeare. He wanted a state-funded, a taxpayer-funded playhouse where Shakespeare's plays would be put on all the time, 24/7, 365. That was the house for Shakespeare. That plan didn't really get off the ground. And then really you need to call the two founding fathers of the National Theatre, Harley Granville Barker and William Archer, in 1904. They published this fantastic document, The Scheme and Estimates for a National Theatre. It was called the Blue Book. It was a privately published pamphlet, incredibly detailed, with a putative repertoire for how it was going to have its opening seasons. And there, Shakespeare represented 1/3 of the total output, notional, at that point. Britain didn't exactly fall into step with their idea, and you have to jump forward another 45 years, 1949, when the British Parliament publishes and passes the National Theatre Act. So they say, okay, we're going to commit £1 million, a huge sum of money in those days, of taxpayer money, to building the theatre. And then things get really interesting, particularly for those of your viewers who were tuning in last week to the discussion about the Royal Shakespeare Company, because through the late 50s and into the early 60s, the RSC and the NT are kind of like that. I'm tempted to quote, "I am bound to thee forever," the notion of these two companies being so interlinked. And that was partly because the RSC, Peter Hall taking over the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre and relaunching it as the Royal Shakespeare Company, and him as a rival with Laurence Olivier to be the first director of the National Theatre. Olivier in 1962 becomes artistic director of the Chichester Festival Theatre. So they both have their own companies. But the question is the government going to provide enough state support for the RSC to survive in the form that Peter Hall has it, and for Olivier to launch the National Theatre? And one of the things that struck me most when I was researching the National Theatre story was we are very lucky in Britain that we had these two incredibly charismatic, dogmatic, indefatigable men, and very ambitious men, who refused to back down. They refused to say, no, Larry, you can have the RSC as part of the National. And Olivier didn't say, it's all right, Peter, you run the National. So we got both of them. And then in 1963, we finally get the National Theatre Company opening at the Old Vic with Hamlet. So that indivisibility, if you like, of Shakespeare and the National Theatre tracks all the way through from 1848 to Olivier directing Peter O'Toole as Hamlet. And perhaps I can give a flavour briefly of that experience, which is a letter that Olivier wrote to his designer, Desmond Healy, when he was preparing that production. And just for context, it's really important to bear in mind that Olivier had played Hamlet in 1937 on stage at the Old Vic, and he had directed and starred in, to Oscar-winning effect, Hamlet as a feature film in 1948. So he knew the play inside out, back to front, and that helps explain the feelings in this letter. So this is Olivier to Desmond Healy on the 27th of May, 1963. Dear Desmond, I am burning to talk to you about Hamlet. It is terribly difficult to feel glossy or new when one has done a thing more than once and then made a film. One really doesn't feel one has much more to say. I do not think it any good my trying to join the Brechtian ranks in the presentation. That would only be a lame follow-on to a trend upon which others have put their stamp with far more authority than I could. So I suppose the aura of the play which still exists with me is what would be thought today a romantic one. And with Peter O'Toole as the principal, it would be hard to think otherwise. So you and I have simply got to costume it in a fashion that spells Hamlet. Michael Redgrave would like Claudius as a more romantic type of Henry VIII. One wants the Queen redolent of the most voluptuous period of womanhood, and Ophelia to have a Victorian feeling. I tried to convey this in the film, and it was perfectly all right. I wish to God you were here so that we could talk and talk all night long. It would help so much. Yours ever, Larry. So, a director concerned that the play has become, shall we say, stale, flat, and unprofitable, that he's done it before and doesn't necessarily feel that he wants to have to do it again. So that's by way of taking us through to the start of Shakespeare at the National and we can come back to contextualizing how his plays fit into a repertoire, a production history that's now more than 900 productions strong.
Wow, thank you for that wonderful Praesian overview of the beginnings of this story, Daniel. And you know, the irony is Sir Peter Hall succeeding Olivier, did he not, in 1973 as artistic director? So this relationship between the RSC and the National Theatre, maybe called a love-hate, Montague and Capulet relationship, or something more complicated, is, I think, certainly something that is still with us. Sargon, you have acted at both the RSC and the National Theatre. You are an actor, a practitioner, so you are at home in all fronts of this Cold War, so to speak. Is your relationship to Shakespeare something that is more personal? Do you see a difference in the way Shakespeare is approached at the National as opposed to at other theatres in Britain?
Well, looking back on my experience with Simon and Emily, with Antony and Cleopatra at the National, one of the great things about working with Simon is that the process of unlocking the text is forensic. We didn't do a table read until the very end of week 1. Up until then, we were just trying to decipher what in the world we were saying to one another. And then you're looking for, it's a lot of detective work, because you're constantly looking for clues. You're looking for different types of rhetoric that the characters use, antithesis in the language that can unlock the text and give you an insight into character, ambiguity and irony in the text. And the resources at the National and at the RSC mean that they can call upon scholastic help and have experts come in before the text is put on its feet, to give you an insight into what the country may have been like at the time that Shakespeare was writing, and his influences. But ultimately, regardless of where you're performing, the goal is to communicate the text as clearly as possible and as truthfully as you can. And I've been fortunate enough to work with some terrific actors, Ray Fiennes, for example, who have the dexterity to speak the verse at the speed of thought. And you can learn from a performance like that. Sadly, I didn't have any scenes alongside Sophie Okonedu. But initially we treated it as not unlike a foreign language. And it takes time. And, you know, the National, it's kind of unnerving. It can be unnerving because you're aware of the prestige and the reverence. It's revered, the Shakespeare and the theatre, but you have to sort of let go of that, because there's a danger of being overawed. And if you're overawed, you might become intimidated and ultimately capitulate. And so it's dangerous. But there are time constraints at the National as well, because it's a 5-act play. And so you rehearse a scene, and the next time you come back to the scene, it might be 2 weeks later. So you've got to be prepared when you go up there. You, at the very least, be off book. Yeah.
No, that certainly resonates with my experience, having worked at the National in the past, which I was lucky enough to do, is that you have this enormous concrete battleship-like building on the south bank of the Thames, and you descend underneath the ground into this windowless space, and you emerge, and they have a complete replica of the Olivier stage to rehearse on, with a functioning revolve, which is something that no theater in America could ever dream of having. But then as you work, you're absolutely right, Sargon, that the panic or the prestige or the nerves just kind of melt away, and you need to put the show on, and it becomes a democratic space very quickly.
Exactly right.
Sense of the material.
That's right. And I remember, I'm very grateful that I didn't start at the National Theatre. I think I may well have been slightly overwhelmed, but being at the National and doing a vocal warm-up before every performance with the cast, there is a collective gratitude. You don't take it for granted that you're at the National, you're telling this story, and in this particular case, we happen to be proud of the production that we were in.
Yeah, very well said. I think Emily Burns, you have worked in the past at the National. You are working currently at the National. How do you come to this question of Shakespeare and its relationship to the National Theatre?
Yeah, the first Shakespeare production I saw at the National, I didn't even see at the National, I saw an NT Live of Hamlet, directed by Nicholas Heitner in 2010 at an Odeon in Guildford. And I think at that point in time, I'd been to the National once before on a school trip. And at a point that I saw Hamlet in this NT Live production, NT Live spearheaded by David Sable, who's our producer on Romeo and Juliet, and a Washingtonian himself. I was piecing about in academic undergraduate studies, trying to get to grips with Shakespeare, and I think really struggling, particularly as you start to engage with critical theory and with individual critics. I think Stephen Greenblatt, who you had on the Shakespeare Hour previously, I had read Hamlet in Purgatory as sort of preparation for seeing it for the first time. A brilliant book, totally revelatory about the play, if you know the play well, which I didn't. And so I had this idea that it was this incredibly complicated piece, predominantly about purgatory, focused on that. I remember something about the Irish potato famine being at the core of something that he understood about it. And I went in going, I don't know if I'm going to get any of this. And what I found out from watching the production was for the first time, I sort of realized, gosh, his dad died. And I'd never, in reading it over and over again, that I'd never, even though I knew it was in the plot, it was never something that I had felt. And then it was Rory Kinnear speaking Hamlet, and I suddenly was aware that I think that was my first real connection to Shakespeare as a writer and as a human writer. And so I suppose, to come to your early point about Shakespeare in Britain today, Shakespeare in the National Theatre, I think I follow on from Sargon of saying difficult. Shakespeare is difficult, and one of the greatest difficulties is to both make his work, make the core of the work, which Simon does so brilliantly, the efforts to make the language accessible to the listener, while at the same time never pretending to the listener that the language itself is ever going to be easy. And that's, I think, the greatest challenge, particularly with how early you meet him in your school curriculum, the point at which you're being sort of force-fed a synopsis and then being given a bit of the balcony scene to read, and it's meant to make sense. It's so difficult, as Sargon says, to convince the young reader, the young listener, that this is a foreign language, basically, and that you are not insufficient in coming to it if you find it difficult. Because, I've sat in a room with Sargon and Simon, both brilliant Shakespearean practitioners, and we have been baffled by some of what's written down. And I think that what I feel about Shakespeare at the National more generally is the weight of that responsibility, that this can easily be Shakespeare at the National can easily be someone's first experience of Shakespeare in production. And it can be their first chance to see a really well-resourced, well-researched and well-rehearsed production of it. And the weight of responsibility to try and make that an experience that will engender in that viewer a feeling that they might like to do it again. Not because the National particular, of course, you want people to come back, but because of the great richness that his work can offer throughout your whole life. So that's my Shakespeare, difficult and hopefully being made easy.
Yeah, it's interesting. Last week, actually, we talked a great deal about the way Shakespeare is taught and made a requirement for the GCSEs in Britain, which I had been unaware of, and this strange dichotomy of it seeming very complicated when it's taught in schools, and then it becoming something simple and elemental almost in the theater. And I was reminded, hearing your story of Hamlet, about this wonderful story, Daniel, in your book about the 1989 Hamlet at the National Theatre, directed by Sir Richard Eyre, starring Daniel Day-Lewis. And according to legend, he walked off stage in the middle of a performance because instead of seeing the ghost, he saw his father, Cecil Day-Lewis, the former poet laureate, and was so intensely spooked that he just quit in the middle of a performance, and the understudy had to go on, which I think resonates with what you're saying, Sargon and Emily, about how simple it is when you get to the heart of the material. We also have a question from one of our viewers about the relationship between Shakespeare and spaces. How does Shakespeare lend itself to the National Theatre stage or stages? And I realize that we've been talking about the Olivier Theatre, which is one of the 3 theatres on the National Theatre campus. There's the Olivier, the Littleton, and what used to be called the Cottesloe and is now the Dorfman stage. But how does Shakespeare differ when it's used in these 3 different spaces, Daniel?
Well, perhaps we can help illustrate and answer that question if we bring up the second of the 2 prepared slides, which shows the Shakespeare productions at the National Theatre by auditorium since 1963. Again, very briefly, the National was at the Old Vic, a 900-seat proscenium arch theatre from 1963 to 1976. So you can see on that slide 14 of the 78 National Theatre Shakespeare productions were there. But if you look at the top of the chart, the Olivier Theatre on the South Bank, open stage, hugely influenced by the Greek amphitheatre at Epidavros in Denis Lasdun, the architect's conception of the Olivier, 1,050 in the audience on 2 levels, 37 Olivier productions there. And I'll come back briefly to the impact of that before handing over to Simon, Emily, and Sargon. So you have 37 in the Olivier, you have 20 in the Cottesloe, now renamed the Dorfman, which seats between, depending on the configuration, 300, 450 seats. It can be end on, it can be in traverse, it can be, I'm not sure of the correct term of this, what I would call the tennis court, the Wimbledon tennis court setup, where you've got raked, 2 raked banks of seating on either side of a tennis court shaped stage. But it's important to recognize that most of the Cottesloe and Dorfman Shakespeares were the touring productions, small scale, National Theatre Mobile, latterly the National Theatre Education Department, these wonderful productions where you cut down the text to around 60, 70 minutes and you tour to schools' audiences. And then the Littleton Theatre, 890-seat proscenium arch theatre, with Shakespeare done again in a very specific way, because those productions, for the most part, were conceived as touring productions. Therefore, they were designed and conceived to move from proscenium theatre to proscenium theatre around the UK, around the world. And then finally, the temporary theatre, which was built over the National's Theatre Square, its forecourt, if you will, on the banks of the Thames, just had a couple of those small-scale productions. And then finally, before handing over, the point about the Olivier having 37 of those 78 productions is that on the South Bank, if you just do the maths, 1,050 people, a full house in the Olivier, fewer than 400, a full house in the Cottesloe. The sheer number of people who experience Shakespeare at the National, they do so in the Olivier. Approximately 9 out of 10 tickets for all Shakespeare at the National on the South Bank have been sold for the Olivier. So because of the scale of the auditorium, I thought it would be really interesting if Simon, Emily, and Sargon, you could maybe speak to this notion, if we're paraphrasing Hamlet a little bit, suit the production to the auditorium, suit the performance and the play to the auditorium. What is it like? What are the challenges and rewards of Shakespeare being in this immense, very open and public space in the Olivier?
And before we go to Simon, because I want to know the answer too, viewer James C. wants to know, Daniel, is Shakespeare how popular is Shakespeare at the National compared to contemporary plays? I don't know if you know the box office answer to that.
Well, in box office terms, very popular, but maybe we could bring up the first slide just briefly to provide some context, because if we were looking at the Royal Shakespeare Company and Shakespeare's preeminence there, I'll just give you one illustration. The National Theatre in its 57-year history has never staged The Taming of the Shrew. The Royal Shakespeare Company has staged it 16 times whilst the National Theatre has been open, 16 separate productions. The RSC's raison d'etre is to keep cycling through the canon year on year, different directors approaching the same play differently with a suitable gap of time. At the National, Shakespeare is preeminent in that, if we have the slide up, you can see 78 Shakespeare productions, way out ahead of Anton Chekhov with 17, David Hare, 15, Ibsen, and so on and so forth. But those 78 productions are just under 9%. Sorry to throw all these numbers at you, but just under 9% of the total number of productions. So although he looks very preeminent on that most performed playwrights list, there are hundreds of other plays that were world or UK premieres at the National. So Shakespeare is a very important part of the rep, but in a good full COVID-free year, the National is staging 18 or 20 new productions, and on average, it does a new Shakespeare once every 8 months. So it's approximately one and a bit a year within that 20-strong list of productions.
Yeah, I think the average is 1.4. I did the math last night. And you know, it's interesting hearing you talk about the RSC, which cycles through the canon. And indeed, the Shakespeare Theatre for the last 30 years has been that kind of theater that cycles through the canon. And maybe, are we going to become more national theater-like in the future and have the freedom to pick and choose? That's a question about our mission that we should answer on a different episode. But Simon, I'm really curious to hear from the director about, do you tailor the production for the stage when you're directing at the Olivier or the Cottesloe, or the Dorfman or the Littleton?
Well, yes, thank you. What an excellent question from our viewer that asked this about spaces and plays. And yes, I think about Washington, and we have two spaces in Washington: the smaller Klein Theatre and the larger Sydney Harmon Hall. The Sydney Harmon Hall seats 750 and is very flexible. The Klein is a smaller proscenium arch that seats about 450. And so in Washington, there's a similar conversation about what play works in which space. And it is indeed a universal theatre question. I think theatres worldwide are also trying to figure out what are the plays that work best in a really big space. Because the big spaces are the opportunities for theatres to survive financially, and yet they are the hardest spaces to fill. We know Broadway has answered the question through the musical, which is brilliantly equipped to fill a big space. There's a largesse, there's an emotional reach, there's a magnitude, there's a spectacle. And I think that with Shakespeare, fortunately, Shakespeare doesn't like the fourth wall. That's something that we can say with some authority. Having worked at the Globe, I've discovered that that's absolutely true. He likes being, not only does he not like the fourth wall, he likes being essentially physically proximate to the audience. So because of the asides, there is an absolute recognition that there is an audience there. And the closer the actor is to the audience, the more the asides, the inclusion, the monologues make sense. So then you have this paradox about going, well, how do we put Shakespeare into the biggest theatre of all at the National Theatre, the Olivier, when you're not particularly close to the audience? Well, what I've done is to try and make, when I've directed in the Olivier, it as much like a Shakespearean space as possible, i.e. to bring that forestage as close to the front row as we possibly can, and to encourage the actors to step forward and to look as much as you can the audience in the eye and talk directly to them, include them in this experience. And it's much harder to do that in the Littleton, which is the middle-sized theatre, which is very much a proscenium arch space. It's much more formal and it's more difficult to break and include. So in the past, people have said to me, oh, the Olivier is so difficult. It's so big, you're going to get lost in there, and it's hard to feel close to things. But I found through the kind of Shakespearean energy of the storytelling, the hugeness of the characters and the vastness of the stakes. I mean, I think about Antony and Cleopatra, and there are huge wars between countries and empires lost and found, and a love story of epic proportions. And we had a submarine, and I think it's basically, I think Julie Taymor said Shakespeare writes movies when she was on our show. And I think that's absolutely true. So taking Shakespeare into the Olivier is a great opportunity to create a staging that is as big as the writing. I don't know whether, Emily, you worked on Antony and Cleopatra in terms of the editing of the script to try and adapt it for the stage. Would that be something that rings true for you, Emily? And we'd still love to hear from Sargon acting on it as well.
Yes, I think so often your point about the fourth wall is brilliant, and so often that when a character in Shakespeare is speaking out, they are speaking to the whole world. It's not directed at an individual, and it's not directed at it's not so often directed at an imagined other. It is Lear walking forward, carrying Cordelia's body and speaking to the heavens. And there's a huge benefit to that. I suppose I'm just thinking of that physical action of looking there and saying, I want the whole world to hear what I'm about to say. And that feels like such a crucial part of particularly that is often where a protagonist finds themselves, is talking to the whole world.
Yeah, Sargon, does that resonate with you as well? The cinematic contours of Shakespeare's imagination and the need to interact with an audience, breaking the fourth wall when you were performing?
Yes. I didn't have any direct soliloquies in Antony and Cleopatra, but I remember it feels deceptively intimate because the stalls sort of envelop you quite snugly, and yet the circle feels way out. So it took me 2 or 3 or 4 previews even just to get a command of the space. It had been a while since I performed on the Olivier, and I'd have Simon very helpfully coming up to me and saying, listen, on that part, don't forget about that side of the slips or the auditorium. We've had your profile on your back for long enough, and you need that. And just to pick up off Emily, you sometimes get lost in the other actor, but of course you have a responsibility to try and cheat it out to the rest of the auditorium. And in terms of the scope and scale of the performance, my Pompey, to put it mildly, wasn't timid, which was conducive to the space. And it's another wonderful thing about working with the caliber of staff at the National is that we had a terrific production designer, costume designer in Evie, and we initially had our hermeneutics were polar opposites to begin with. She had a wildly different interpretation of the character than I did, certainly aesthetically. And that can be useful to begin with in rehearsals, because you can pick and choose what works and eliminate what doesn't. And she sort of saw Pompey as a maverick renegade hiding away with these pirates. And I said, no, he's not backtracking. This guy's on the attack. Antony is requested back because of the threat that this guy carries. And I said, he's very, very, very proud. And I had this image of, in the context of it being a modern adaptation, modern day interpretation, I kept thinking about Mussolini, and I kept thinking about his prolific naval fleet that he had at one point. And I thought about his charisma, and I thought about the spin and the way he mastered propaganda and managed to seduce his people. And there are clues in the text as well. Antony says of Pompey that he's high in name and power, higher than both in blood and life. And so the first time we see Pompey, I sort of took that quite literally, and I was ecstatic in my perception of how I was loved by the people, how I ruled the seas, how I wanted to take over the world. And even when Pompey learns of Antony having come back from Rome, as mortifying as that is, very quickly he takes it as a compliment that our advances have plucked this wonderful general from Egypt to fight us. So come on, let's get with it. So actually, all of that, and rather brilliantly, again to compliment Evie, I having said all that to Evie, the next thing I know, she's created this fascistic, all-black, severe uniform with a sash to boot. But the key was this military regalia that was dangling from my blazer. And I think I asked you, Simon, or you, Emily, I said, what do you imagine Pompey has done to earn this military regalia? And you said, absolutely nothing. And I said, that's Pompey. That's my key into him.
Terrific, Sargon.
It's all because of nepotism that he's managed to inherit the love of the people, the loyalty of the pirates who were so loyal to his father. But actually, in and of himself, he would get mauled by the triumvirate. So that was a great help.
Well, Sargon, thank you. It's a great reminder for me about status and about magnitude. And these are big, big words that are so critical in that big, big space. Hey, good news for everyone in Washington. Evie Gurney, the costume designer that Sargon's referring to, brilliant person who used to work for Alexander McQueen. So it's really inherited from her work with him. This boldness of imagination is going to, was designing the costumes for Much Ado About Nothing, the production that I'm directing, or was going to be directing in Washington when the shutdown happened, but she will be back designing costumes for Much Ado About Nothing as soon as we reschedule that show. So I'm really excited about sharing her work with all of you. Drew.
Daniel, as Sargon was talking, you raised your hand as if you had been.
Yes. I just wanted to add a couple of brief points about the Olivier, particularly for people who've not seen Shakespeare there. And it was the mention of the submarine, this exhilarating moment in Simon's production, which is that the Olivier is equipped with this extraordinary drum revolve, the resources, the technical resources of that auditorium to transform space when you've got a Shakespeare play that is cross-cutting in cinematic terms between geographic locations hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and just the sheer visceral thrill for an audience of seeing that happen. And then second point about the resources, and this is a budgetary question for the National can offer a director. Sam Mendes directing Simon Russell Beale as King Lear in the Olivier 6 years ago. He had 30 big burly men playing 30 of Lear's 100 Knights. Now, I've seen Lear several times, but I had never before sensed and felt the sheer horror for Goneril and Regan of these guys invading their homes. Now, it's not just a numbers game, but Simon, maybe you could speak to that again. If you have the luxury as a director of 30 men to intimidate, to create this terrible ruckus, to eat those sisters out of house and home, it's a very different Lear than if you have 4.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely right. And I think this is where a different theatre, different strengths. So the Royal Shakespeare Company, or even more so the Globe, there is a great emphasis on the language and the spectacle that is created by the words, and being as accurate and potent as you possibly can be with that. The NT have historically been the place where you can do Hollywood Shakespeare, I would say, that have the resources to bring a submarine or a helicopter or the technology, all the 30 people, as you described so brilliantly. And that's been a very great thrill as a director, that the theatre has won the support through the government, but also through philanthropy, through people giving, both in England and in America, where there's a very important community friends of the National Theatre that make a lot of these productions possible. So it's a very unique thing.
But it also seems, Simon, and maybe this is just my theory, that with the growth of these scenographic resources, you also are able to do not just Hollywood-style Shakespeare, but directorial or autorial Shakespeare in a way, I would argue, different in kind to the Globe and the RSC, where essentially it's about the play and about the language and about the theatrical experience. But at the National Theatre, you can see a director's vision for a show. Emily is like raising her eyebrow, pondering this theory that I'm forwarding. Maybe this is just a way of segueing in. I'll just leave that there, and we can segue into talking about Romeo and Juliet as a film, right? Because it was conceptualized for the stage, and now it's literally being Hollywoodized, or BBCized or PBSized. And have you had to change or reconfigure much of your original concept, or is it indeed a kind of fluid transition from the mise-en-scène to the to the cinematography?
Shall I just kick on giving off some headlines, sharing some headlines, and then maybe Emily, I'd love to hear your view of directors on the National Theatre stages and also our approach to Romeo and Juliet. As Emily mentioned earlier, the NT Live project has been going now on for a number of years, which I'm hoping many of our viewers will have enjoyed, which was essentially plays that are filmed live and broadcast to cinemas around the world. So for Romeo and Juliet, this is something different again, which is to say, let us turn one of the theatres, the Littleton, into a television studio and create a version of the story where the audience is not present for it, and is filmed over 3 weeks and goes through an editing process. So it's much more akin to a movie than it is to a play that is being filmed. Having said that, filming Romeo and Juliet entirely indoors, not on location, presents itself huge challenges, because with Romeo and Juliet, what we associate with that play is the heat of the Mediterranean sun, those beautiful Italian squares. You know, we have Franco Zeffirelli's remarkable account of the play that forged so many people's imaginations of it, followed, of course, by the other great cinematic master of Baz Luhrmann. So inevitably, one trembles somewhat in one's boots, even attempting to be in dialogue with these great artists of cinema. So what Emily and I have devised is a way into this, which in a way reflects the theatrical roots of this experiment, which reflects on a group of actors gathering in a shuttered and closed theatre who have, as it were, gone, let us nonetheless rehearse our play. Let us nonetheless tell our story. And in that process of imagining their way into this story, flashes of their work become realized. So we move from a rehearsal type approach to flashes of something much more realized. So we move from, as it were, sticks representing the knives and swords of these warring families into, at the heat of the battle, a costume change, and sticks have become replaced by real knives. So there's a feeling of the imagination shifting from something provisional and exploratory into something profoundly real and profoundly of life and death. And it's that flickering between states of reality that we hope to capture. Emily.
Yes, while you were talking then about the shuttered theatre, I thought it might be worth dwelling for a second on, Daniel took us brilliantly through the architecture of the three spaces. A virtue of the theatre spaces at the National is that because the theatres were always designed for plays to happen in rep, so that multiple productions would be available at one moment in time, and the fluidity of being able to move from performing one at 7:30 one evening and another at 2:30 p.m. the following afternoon dictates to some extent the architecture of the building. So specifically in the Littleton, if you imagine that you were looking at the Littleton from above, you were looking down the fly tower onto the stage. This is the Littleton here, and my thumbs are where the audience sit. The Littleton exists again in size right above it, and also to the stage left, right-hand side of it. And so at any one moment in time, pre-COVID, you'd always have two sets that existed there, and you might have a performance here of, I'm trying to think of two plays that have been in rep, but I can't, so a performance here, and then it gets lifted up onto a truck, the whole set gets tracked back here and put down, and then this set gets picked up and wheeled in here. And so when we're making this film, we're able to make use of all three of those spaces, which gives us this huge, as our director of photography has said, unbelievable resource of this sort of soundstage. But the second reason I bring that up is to reference Simon's point about coming together to make this play. We've talked a lot in the last few weeks about handmade miracles. And so how in this hybrid of film and theatre, what's the difference between the viewer's relationship to the work in theatre versus on film? And something that we celebrate so brilliantly in theatre is the work the audience member is willing to do to fill in the gaps. And we don't need to see we don't need establishing shots of the Nile and of some pyramids for us to know that we're in Egypt. We're happy to hear 4 bars of music and for the lighting to have changed to something more Mediterranean, and for the particular texture of a wall to be slightly more sandblasted, and we're in Egypt. And so the film, this version of the film, celebrates that sort of magic by finding a way to make the viewer at home, as they will be when watching this, as active in viewing the film, as active in filling in those gaps as the audience member would normally be. And so to come back to the handmade miracle and the architecture of space, we're trying to celebrate the feeling that this group of actors have joined together to read through the play, to run the play, and that as they do, they find more and more of the machine of the building at their disposal to try and create something closer to what they might have done on stage. They find a bit of wall to drag in to be part of a room. Suddenly there are chandeliers hung somewhere, or that a floor is brought in and someone walks across it, their costume changes, and suddenly they are Lady Capulet, not somebody in jeans and t-shirt as though on rehearsal. And the Littleton specifically as a space that's so used to housing multiple sets simultaneously becomes such a fertile place for us to imagine this production, because we are so used to the idea that while any one play is going on, the physical material world of any other play is existing in the wings. I'm sure Sargon will be able to remind me of, while you were doing Antony and Cleopatra, you might have been running from playing somebody in Rome to playing somebody in Egypt, but in doing so, you're running through the Ziegfeld Follies, for example, because that happens to be the other set sitting in the backstage area.
That's a brilliant analysis. And before we hear from Daniel about whether this has actually been attempted before, or what the lessons might be from history's point of view, and indeed from Sargon about responding to that, I would just like to also add particularly about the acting, which we spoke about magnitude earlier. And of course, I normally spend most of my time in rehearsals going to actors, good, but bigger, good, but louder. And I think it's going to take quite a big rewiring to go good, but quieter. Because I think there's such an ingrained part of me that's worried about whether I'll actually hear it. But I am reliably assured by those in the world of film that really one doesn't need to speak very loudly when approaching these questions. But yes, Daniel.
I think it sounds absolutely fantastic, and I think that I can't think of precedents within the national's history in terms of, I mean, you didn't get the opportunity. You're not reconfiguring a completed stage production for the screen. That, of course, has happened with Shakespeare at the National. It happened with Ian Home and Richard Eyre's King Lear. It happened with Trevor Nunn's and Henry Goodman's Merchant of Venice, and the Deborah Warner, Fiona Shaw, Richard II. So those were all taken to a TV studio, and they had the luxury of working with actors who had played dozens of performances before the cameras started running. I think it's very interesting, this notion of, not going out on location and having to be a hybrid. And something that fascinates me about your production within the context of the previous national approaches to Romeo and Juliet, because again, to come back to the earlier point about the comparison between the RSC and the National, the RSC has done 16 Romeo and Juliets in the time that the National has done 3, and yours will effectively be the 4th. And this may be his question as much for Emily as for Simon. I'm fascinated with my work on Shakespeare on film as a lecturer and author on textual editing. for film. If it's axiomatic that you keep dialogue to a minimum in a contemporary film drama, how much of the text do you preserve? So just because I was very struck in the press release that the National has put out saying the film's going to run about 90 minutes. I hope that's correct. And so I looked up on the NT archive that the Tim Supple's Olivier production of Romeo and Juliet ran just under 3 hours, excluding the interval. We have, I don't know how long Bill Bryden's 1974 one was, and then you jump forward to Ben Power's 65-minute edit for a school's audience, but you have the 2-hour traffic of our stage there for you. So there are a few numbers to juggle with, and I'm fascinated by, is the first pass at the script cutting within scenes rather than cutting scenes, and then how does that progress?
And also the writing, it seems to me, of Shakespeare in that play is so theatrical. The way the characters change, their showpiece monologues really are designed for an Elizabethan playhouse. And just showing the change in Juliet from the beginning of the play to the end of the play, is there a way to foreshorten that on the screen rather than use all of Shakespeare's language?
Emily, I mean, I'm going to pass the buck to you on that because I think
we are at like 50 minutes, I believe, or so. So I don't want us to end without hearing some Shakespeare, since we've been talking about Shakespeare. We forgot to do that last week because we had so much to talk about.
Well, I wonder actually, Drew, but should we take this moment briefly for me to talk about next week? And then we'll sweep round and hear from our three guests about Emily's, starting off with Emily's response to editing with some Shakespeare, and then to Sargon and to his passage, and to Daniel to summarize. Brilliant. So look, just to say, everybody, that we start next month, November, by discussing Shakespeare and musicals, which Drew is going to be presenting with our guest co-host, Alan Paul. Which is going to be followed the week after by Shakespeare and the Supernatural in the spirit of Halloween. And on October the 18th, we revisit one of Shakespeare's most beloved plays, The Winter's Tale, as the nights draw in and it gets a little bit colder. All these episodes, you'll be pleased to hear, will be live. So there's no need to submit questions ahead of time, and you can learn more and register online. And I will be sending in weekly updates, of course, from London to give you a unique glimpse into Romeo and Juliet. So I don't know whether I'll look increasingly haggard or increasingly jolly over the weeks to come. You will be the judge of that. Keep tuning in, and let's go back to Emily.
Yes. So editing. Well, I suppose the first thing to say is what an arrogant thing to do generally, given that Shakespeare's existed for centuries and is in many people's minds unrivaled. There's a sort of stealing yourself before you begin. Generally, but there's also comfort in, for example, the existence of the RSC or the Globe or any other number, or the Shakespeare Theatre Company in Washington, any other number of theatres around the world, that no matter what we do to Romeo and Juliet now, it is unlikely that we will change Shakespeare's play forever, or that we will do it some irrevocable damage that means that future audiences don't have the opportunity to hear the text in its entirety in the future. So with that knowledge safely on board, I think part of the journey is taking ideas about contemporary dramaturgy into the edit. So things that feel like almost rules now. Don't introduce somebody at the end of the play unless it's a comedic deus ex machina. So Romeo and Juliet with Friar John in Act 5, Scene 2. We've never met him. He's never been referenced. He's never been mentioned. And suddenly he is responsible for a crucial plot point. It's a shame we've got rid of him. How have we done it? You'll find out in the film. So that's one thing. Or strange slippages that feel like they are probably more to do with the company that Shakespeare was working with rather than what he wanted to write in the play. For example, Benvolio lives, breathes, speaks. Act 3, Scene 1, we never hear from him again. It's not explained. And suddenly somebody looking remarkably like Benvolio but called Balthazar exists. Now, we can celebrate that, or we can go, do you know what? What if Benvolio did the whole thing? This doesn't cut it down, but it gives you a tighter core to the play where you're able to invest in a smaller company of people and think about their experience over the 90 minutes in a more wholesale way, rather than individuals as patchwork in a larger picture you're trying to represent. There's then often swathes of things that, particularly, I'm thinking of the beginning of the play and the ribaldry. I can't even remember what the particular collar, that's it, the word collar is the subject of a joke for about 12 lines at the beginning of the play. It doesn't mean much to us now. We can try, we can do our best, but that we can sort of get rid of that. And the process has gone on like that. And so I hope the experience is one of feeling the high octane experience of a play that takes place in only 4 days. It's about 100 hours of these people's lives from the moment we meet them to the moment that Romeo and Juliet are both dead. And in a 3-hour production, I think it can be quite difficult to remember that these people's lives have changed over a series of 3 nights. And so while of course I'm sure there are things that we lose, there's so much that we gain from chasing these characters at the same and experiencing the way their world changes over and over again in the space of these few days at the same pace as we are watching 90 minutes of it. That's my bit on editing Romeo and Juliet.
And just to add on very briefly to that, I mean, I think what's fascinating for me, I don't know what others agree with, is that I think when you go and see Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, which I thought was just so astonishing, it's actually very difficult to go back to the theatre after seeing that film, because he's sort of used this language of cinema to brilliantly elucidate Shakespeare's language and plotting in a way Shakespeare was always waiting for Baz Luhrmann to come along and finally do the production that we all have dreamt of seeing. And we are a humble cousin of that, I hope. Anyway,
sorry, Emily, I just want to add, you mentioned Friar John. That is one of the few explicit references to plague, is it not, in Shakespeare? That's the reason he can't get into Mantuas, because the doors are closed to plague. So it makes you think, could solve that in a cinematic way, visually, in an interesting way. Sargon, you were rehearsing Romeo and Juliet before the theaters closed due to plague. I wonder if there is a passage you would like to share with us all as we talk?
Yes. I don't know if I have time to do this, but I just wanted to say, off the back of what Daniel was talking about, I don't know if you remember this, Simon, but about 1.5 years ago, we workshopped with Ben Power, just for 2 days, Romeo and Juliet. And the point of it was to think of a way, a revelatory way of putting our imprint on this play that had been performed untold number of times, and to see how inventive we could be without compromising the purity and clarity of storytelling for all the 15 and 16-year-olds who were supposed to come, who hadn't seen the production before. And we came to a stumbling block, and it was us hearing about Friar John failing to send Friar Lawrence's letter to Romeo because he was quarantined. And I remember it was a stumbling block, because we were like, this is so outlandish. It's so unrelatable for the audience. It's unplayable. What do you do? And here we are. And so this idea of relevance and Shakespeare evolving to our time, it feels like we are catching up to him.
Absolutely,
yes.
So, completely.
But I have a bit of text, and well, let's see. I have it in front of me. Let's see just how much of it I can remember. Art thou a man? Thy form cries out thou art. Thy tears are womanish. Thy wild acts denote the unreasonable fury of a beast. Unseemly woman in a seeming man, and ill-beseeming beast in seeming both. Thou hast amazed me. By my holy order, I thought thy disposition better tempered. Hast thou slain Tybalt? Wilt thou slay thyself, and slay thy lady that in thy life lives, by doing damned hate upon thyself? What? Rouse thee, man. Thy Juliet is alive, for whose dear sake thou wast but lately dead. There art thou happy. Tybalt would kill thee, but thou slewest Tybalt. There art thou happy. The law that threatened death becomes thy friend and turns it to exile. There art thou happy. A pack of blessings light upon thy back. Happiness courts thee in her best array. But like a mishaven and sullen wench, thou pout'st upon thy fortune and thy love. Take heed, for such die miserable.
Terrific, Sargon. Thank you. That's brilliant. What a fantastic reminder of just the sheer vigor and energy and intensity of that language. True.
Yeah, Daniel, do you have any, we are way past an hour. So do you have any final thoughts you would like to leave us with? I think we've touched on all these bases, the difference between the National and the RSC, the Olivier and the other stages, the transfer from stage to screen, and the specific nature of Shakespeare at the National. So are there any
I thought I could maybe bring us full circle without taking us too far away from the Romeo and Juliet theme, because that notion of the competition between the RSC and the National, when Peter Hall and Laurence Olivier were running those companies respectively in the 60s, you're absolutely right, Drew, to have said it's a little bit Capulet and Montague, and that's how I characterized them in a passage in the National Theatre story. So maybe we could just give the last word from me, at least, to those two extraordinary figures, because in 1967, the National was putting on As You Like It, and so was the Royal Shakespeare Company, to open 10 days apart. So you have a kind of powwow between Olivier and Hall, and Olivier writes to Hall, there is a good deal for us both to worry about, not only the official repercussions from the taxpayer if we start duplicating each other's repertoire. Your future plans indicate that our policies are drawing embarrassingly close. I wake up one morning and find you in bed beside me. Charming, of course, but surprising. So Peter Hall replies to Olivier, we have always said that Shakespeare and contemporary plays are what we're about at the RSC. Your main line at the National is to give a representative repertoire of world drama, but our policies can't be mutually exclusive. Otherwise, you'd never do a Shakespeare and we'd never do a foreign author. I'm sure enough plays have been written for us to carve them up. So it's, maybe it's the carving up of the world of drama between these two extraordinary figures in terms of the relationship between the RSC and the National.
Yeah, or as Lessing puts it in Nathan the Wise, we must be friends. And I think that is, a good note to end on, if any, in this time of such profound unrest and disquiet around the world. Thank you all of our guests for joining us. You were brilliant. It was lovely. I think we could talk for hours, but unfortunately we must call an end. So this is me signing off from Washington. Simon?
Absolutely. What a wonderful episode. My thanks to Sargon, to Daniel, to Emily, to you, Drew, and to all of you for watching. See you next time. Good night.